Hey guys, this is Mr. Shear, and we're talking today about where our history comes from. Whatever's written in that textbook, who came up with that, who decided what goes in there and what doesn't, and how do historians actually go about doing their job? Some of these may be questions that you've had before, so we're going to examine some of those, discover how a historian works and how he comes up with that history, and really kind of look at how accurate is that history anyway, based on all of that. So here's what I want to do to start. I want you to start by taking the role of the historian. You're going to write one short paragraph. Paragraph is 4 sentences, so that should be at least a couple sentences here. 4 sentences. I want you to write the history of last school year in just a paragraph, okay? So you can talk about what happened, or what are some of the major events that you remember, or what was important. I want you to be descriptive. Write your own little history of last year, but try to keep it down to 1 paragraph. And after you get the chance to do that, we're going to come back and sort of look at maybe what you wrote or how that might compare to what other people wrote. So take a minute right now, write your history of last year. Anything you remember, just a short paragraph to tell us what took place throughout last school year. Okay, so as a historian, how do you think you did? Did you do a good job telling the story of what happened last year? Think about a few things. Number one, how accurate is your history? How well did you remember it? Was it hard to remember certain things? Did you kind of a little blurry on the details? Did some of it just feel like last year was forever ago and you couldn't remember any of it? Do you think you missed anything important? Is there something maybe in another student's history that probably should have been in your history? It's really super important, but you totally forgot about it. Did you have to maybe look at your phone, look at something else, and think, okay, gosh, what was last year? What happened last year? Did you need to look up anything to help jog your memory at all? And even, do you think that there are other things that maybe other students included about different events, or maybe other students talked about the same events but said different things about them? Might there be conflicting accounts or stories of what happened? All of this probably is true. You probably forgot some things. You probably missed some things. You probably needed something to remind you, because remembering what happened in the past is hard, especially when it comes to details. And so reconstructing the past, like a historian does, it actually is kind of hard, because our brains are not very good at remembering at least as well as we would want to. So when we think about a historian, like we all have this stereotype, like there's your historian guy, right? He's got the old dusty books and he's got the pipe, and like that's what historians do, is they just read over really old books over and over and over again. But really, when it comes to being a historian and what they do or how they work, it's not an easy job to piece together. Really, they're kind of more like detectives, because their job is to try to piece together what happened in the past. Okay, so we know that an event happened, but we really don't know how the story goes. The historian's job is to put that story together and craft together and piece together what actually happened as best they can from the evidence. What they use for that evidence and to figure out how it happened is a number of different sources and different things. So they use different strategies to examine the past and to look back and try to piece together, to get this together as best they can and figure out the best possible and most accurate story that they can based on the evidence. So let me give you an example, and we're kind of going to go through this, and you can kind of sort of go through some of the same experience that a historian goes through as they try to figure out the past. Here's a video, and we're going to watch this video together. And as you watch it, I just want you to watch carefully, because the question that's going to come afterwards is going to determine how carefully you watch. So watch very, very carefully as we view this video together. Okay, pretty crazy. Now let's find out how carefully you watched. Oh, let's not watch it again. There we go. So what I want you to do, and the question that I'm going to ask you now is, how did he do it? Think about the magic trick, and I want you to describe, and you're going to give you a chance here to write, how you think the trick was done. If you're not sure, take a guess. I want you to explain your answer, but just what's your best guess at how that trick was done? Try a sentence or two, and then we'll kind of look at it from there. Okay, so that was probably pretty tough, especially just kind of watching it for the first time. So what I want you to think about now is, what would help to actually find out what went on with this trick and to figure out what the secret was. What could you do that would actually help you come to the answer there? So if you were actually trying to figure this out, what else would help you do that? I want you to think about who might you be able to talk to, or what might you want to do or be able to see. What kinds of things would actually get you to the bottom of this, assuming that you can't just Google it, okay? Or maybe you can, I don't know, maybe that's one of your answers. But I want you to write 2 to 3 things that you think, if you were sitting there or you just watching this, what could you do to research to figure out how that trick would work? Okay, so write 2 to 3 things in the question box and see if you can figure out what you might do. Okay, so what'd you come up with? I've heard a lot of different answers, and there are a lot of things that probably would help. Maybe nothing more than watching it again. You're like, a lot of you are probably thinking, okay, if I saw it again, I know what to look for. All right, if I could watch it again and again and again, that would help me sort of get more used to it, and I'd be able to look more carefully at different things. So that's probably at the list. Second, maybe something that would really help is to have different camera views. Sometimes the point of view that you're looking at it from might hide something, but if you had a different camera view, maybe from behind, maybe from the side, maybe kind of from an angle, how would that help your understanding, or could that help your understanding of how the trick was done? Certainly it would probably help to interview maybe the magician, and maybe he wouldn't tell you how it's done, but maybe if you could just talk to him, or if you could talk to the assistants that work with him, or maybe even somebody that was there live in the audience. Talking to them might be able to tell you a little bit something different, or give you a little bit more different information about the trick. Finally, what if you could inspect the props? What if you could look at the props that he used to do the trick? Do you think you might find something in there that would get you to the bottom of how it was done? I think that's probably a pretty good chance. Now I'm actually going to back it up a little bit, because I want to be fair to you. If you're trying to figure it out, I want you to be able to kind of look at it and see what you can come up with. So I'll show it to you one more time and see if watching it again if that can kind of reveal anything for you, if you can see anything a little bit different this time. Okay. Sorry, we're gonna flip through here. Did that help? Do you know how it was done now? Here's the worst part of this whole thing. I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't know the answer, and you can probably Google it and you can go through all that, but I don't know. So sorry about that part. But what you're doing as you're looking at this and you're considering, this is the same way that a historian works on the past. They've got a puzzle. They've got to try to figure out how something happened. And they go through a lot of the same things that you would want to go through to try to figure it out. Historians will, just like watching again, they'll study the event out and they'll look for different details and they'll go back and look for different hints or details. We talked about different camera views. Historians will try to look at events from different perspectives. Okay, a lot of times we tend to look at history or an event in a particular perspective. But they'll try to look from different perspectives of different people that might have experienced it. And just in the same way, they'll use many sources and many different points of view of the events and try to find as many sources they possibly can of people that were there or were present to the event. And finally, they'll look at documents. They'll look at artifacts. They'll look at anything that they can get their hands on from the time that might give more clues about how the events took place. And then it comes together, hopefully it comes together for them and they can put it together. So what kind of sources will historians use? There are a couple types. Primary sources, what we call secondary sources, and then one that you might not have heard of before called tertiary sources. And we're not really going to get into what they are today because historians don't use them as much. They're a little bit more not relevant to what we're talking about today. But let's talk for a second about primary and secondary sources. So a primary source is an immediate firsthand account of a topic from people who had a direct connection with it, okay? And that's why it's called primary. Those people were there or those people experienced it and they were there. It is a firsthand account. In many cases, when reconstructing history, these are the most valuable sources because think about, like, for example, Whisper Down the Lane. You ever play that game when you're in kindergarten, elementary school, whatever? You say a phrase or something like that or tell a secret and whisper it in somebody's ear. And by the time it gets through so many people, it doesn't sound anything like it was supposed to sound in the first place. History is that way too. The more hands the more people that it goes through, the more it changes, the more that story changes. So primary sources are most valuable because they're as close as you can get to the event as possible. Doesn't mean that they're perfect, and sometimes they're not always accurate, but they're the best source that we can have because of that. So primary sources can be all kinds of things. They can be personal letters or journals from people that were there at the time period. They can be original photographs. They can be newspaper articles that were contemporary or current to the time. They can be legal documents or government documents that took place. But they're all firsthand accounts or firsthand from what happened or what's going on at the time. Oops. Even artifacts. When we mentioned that a little bit in the last slide. Artifacts are things that were there, part of or present for the event, all right? And then you have secondary sources. Secondary sources are like the next best thing to primary sources. It's kind of one step removed. They're usually created later by someone who did not experience it firsthand or participate in the events, all right? So it's somebody that wasn't really there, but usually what happens is that person that is writing the secondary source is looking at primary source documents and interpreting them. So this person wasn't really there, but they've talked to somebody who has, or they've looked at primary source documents to come up with their story. So secondary sources can be anything from books written by authors to scholarly articles that are written years later about a topic, newspaper or magazine articles that are written at a later date by somebody else who was not directly involved, videos or documentaries that are made many years later. All of those things are secondary sources. They're done by people who weren't there, but they've looked at the evidence and they've put it together for themselves. So there's a lot of value in secondary sources as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to take pause here for a second, and I'm going to ask you a couple questions. And basically, I'm going to give you the name of a source, and I want you to try to determine whether you think that's a primary source or a secondary source. And then we'll kind of look through there. How'd you do? Okay. Obviously, the thing to keep in mind as you're looking at those is, and to ask yourself is, was that person there? Was that a first-hand account? Those are the ones you came up as being primary source, like the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Um, if it's somebody retelling that story that wasn't there, wasn't contemporary to that time period, it's happening at a later time, that's usually a clue that it was secondary. Okay? So when historians put all this together, they gather their sources and they're trying to figure out what is actually happening. So they gather all these sources, they compare what's in each source. Well, this guy said this, but this guy said this. And they look for similarities and they look for truth. And they determine what most likely happened based on as many sources as they possibly can as they try to recreate the past. Then, when they're done and when they feel like they've got that, that's what they write down and that's what they base their story on. And that's what becomes our history. They've taken all these sources, they've looked at it, they've reviewed it, they've done all the things that you did to try to figure out the magic trick. They've looked at sources again and again, they've examined artifacts, they've gone through that process. And then when they've figured out the best possible account of that story, that's what they write down as being our history. So the question is, how accurate is it? I just said it's like our best reconstruction of that history. But is it 100% accurate? Well, not 100%, I'm sure. But how accurate it is depends on a couple things. How good were the sources? All right. If you're looking at a source by somebody who is extremely biased, so let's say it's a source about the Civil War, and you're reading a source of a Confederate soldier, and they're very, very angry about something that happened in their family, or their brother was shot in the war or something like that, their account might be really, really biased. And maybe all the facts that are represented there aren't exactly as things were. So the quality of the sources and the bias in the sources make a big difference. And not just the sources too, what about the people that are the historians that are working on too? So another thing is, how many sources are there? The further you go back in time, the less sources that we have. There aren't a whole lot of primary sources from thousands and thousands of years ago. And so with fewer sources, that means there are more. So sorry about that. So that means that the more sources there are, the more obviously the more accurate you can be, and the less sources there are, that's obviously going to be a little bit less accurate. So that's something to consider as well. And then what about the historian, the guy that's putting this all together? Do they have a bias? Has their life experiences helped shape them to maybe look at history a certain way? All of these things come into play, and that is what makes us kind of ask the question, really, how accurate is our history? Historians normally do a good job of piecing together these puzzles. They use good sources and they put together their best guess at what happened in history. But at the end of the day, that's kind of what it is. It's our best recreation of that history. Can some of it be confirmed as being, we're pretty doggone sure that that's the truth? Yes, absolutely. But there's always some elements of, okay, well, there's a little bit of interpretation here, or is that really how it happened, or is that just how that person said it happened? All of those things are part of our history. And so while historians work to try to make it as absolutely accurate as possible, there's always at least some question in what we've got. And always are there more pieces missing. Something will happen a couple years later and somebody will find a new document and and the answer will be, well, we didn't know that before. Now that changes everything, and that can change the way that we view history as well. So as we come to the end of this, you should be able to kind of determine how historians look at the past, all right? And the process that they go through to evaluate the past. We also should know what primary and secondary sources are and kind of compare the difference between the two of them. We should also have an idea of what we need to think about when we read our history. And if we're trying to decide how correct or how accurate our history, what are some of the things that impact that? So those are kind of the ideas. We're going to leave you here now with the opportunity for a little exit ticket to determine what you've learned today and to kind of think about this for a little bit. So thanks for your learning today. Hopefully you can figure out that magic trick, and we'll talk to you next time.